Greetings, scholars. Thus begins your off-site AP Euro review for Unit 14, Europe at the turn of the 21st century. I'm looking at the review sheet that you have for this unit. I'm going to go down from the top to bottom. And as far as changes for women after World War II, across Europe, by the end of the war, women have the right to vote. They're running for office. They're entering increasingly jobs held by men, and they're entering universities. By the time we get to the 60s and 70s, women across Europe are earning what were called, in modern parlance, reproductive rights. They're getting access to contraception, abortion, they're marrying later, they're cohabitating without marriage, and their illegitimate births are increasing. Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called The Second Sex in the 60s, in which she's calling for the equality of women. She's calling for women to take control of their sexuality, to take control of their reproduction, so that they can be on an equal basis with men as far as the workplace and entering universities. Margaret Thatcher, one of the most important women since the end of World War II. She's the Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1979 to 1990. Contemporary of Ronald Reagan, a hardcore conservative. She undoes some of the things that Clement Attlee did in the Labour Party. Remember, Clement Attlee at the end of World War II nationalized the public health system and took over the steel mills and the coal mines and the railroads and the national airlines, and Margaret Thatcher is going to privatize a lot of these things, and she's going to shut a lot of the factories down, and she's going to pursue a very conservative political agenda. Angela Merkel is the current Chancellor of Germany, and she's most noted recently for leading a bailout of Greece, this very sort of precarious Euro state member that's broker than broke, and she's also sort of leading the humanitarian acceptance of about 1 million refugees from the Middle East, mostly from the current Syrian civil war. Demographic changes in Europe after World War II. Well, basically, every European country is having less babies, and immigrants are taking the place of non-Europeans. The population of Europeans is getting older. They're consuming more government pensions and healthcare services, and there's a corresponding need for more taxpayers, and immigrants are coming in to fill this gap. Some of the problems, well, the immigrants are coming largely from the former colonial empires of the European nations, and they're largely Arabs, and they're largely blacks from North Africa, especially regarding France. Many are Muslim. Many, perhaps most, are poor and uneducated. Many of them come from countries with no democratic tradition. And Muslim countries, often they're coming with a firm opposition to female equality and female sexual freedom, and this is leading to conflict in these very secular, very liberated, sort of quasi-Christian European countries. As far as the Europeans, the governments are officially, and the EU is officially embracing diversity and assimilation, but this is very difficult because the Europeans don't have this tradition of a large multi-ethnic racial group assimilating them. Unemployment remains high for many of these immigrants, and many of the common people in these countries oppose what the elites, what the power structure is doing, welcome these people in, thus giving rise to parties like the National Front in France. Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie, are leading a very, it's a large party in France, and it's an anti-immigrant, wants to stop immigration and wants to boot them out. And in 2002, Jean-Marie Le Pen won 15% of the vote. He's one of the two candidates for the president of France. As far as Russia versus Ukraine, in 2014, Russia seized and then held elections in and annexed the Crimea. And the Crimea, if you look on a map, is way, way, way down in southern Ukraine. Ukraine is an independent country as of the demise and the breakup of the former Soviet Union. Not only has Russia seized the Crimea and made it part of Russia, Russia has encouraged separatists in eastern Ukraine in what's called the Donbass region, and the Russians have sent in ununiformed soldiers, have sent in military supplies, and this continues to be a grievance of the Ukrainians against Russia. And there's limited sanctions by the EU against Russia for doing this to this day. Vladimir Putin As president of Russia, he has been working hard to build up the Russian military. He's pursued a very aggressive foreign policy at odds with almost everything the United States is concerned about. He's taken the Ukrainian Crimea. He has intervened in Syria on behalf of the Assad dictatorship. Putin has virtually taken over the TV stations and what was once a lively press under Yeltsin. He's jailed opposition leaders, and he's trying to bring back pride to this Russian people who feel they've been embarrassed and they've been abused and they've been sort of condescended to. Problems between the EU and Turkey. Tayyip Erdogan is the current president of Turkey. He's the leader of an openly Islamist party. He has muzzled the press. He's jailed critics of his government. He supports Islamic law against secularism since the founder of modern Turkey, Mr. Ataturk. Erdogan has permitted the wearing of the female covering, the burqa, the chador, in public places. The number one thing, though, that Erdogan is still supporting, and that is back in the 70s, Turkey invaded Cyprus, which is an independent country, primarily Greek, to protect the Turkish minority in Cyprus. Cyprus was talking about uniting with Turkey's longtime enemy, Greece. So there still is a Turkish army presence in Cyprus. And then there's that lingering anger over Armenia, plus the Turks oppress their Kurdish minority. And currently, as I'm giving you this spiel, there is a German humorist who sort of irreverently mocked Mr. Erdogan, and Erdogan is going after him in German court. So these things collectively are turning off many Europeans to the Turkish request to join the EU. The European sovereign debt crisis refers to a handful of countries which are virtually bankrupt. In particular, the Greeks ran out of money a couple of years ago, and the EU has bailed them out, has given them a line of credit. This basically means German and Dutch and Scandinavian money. And there is some sentiment in the EU to kick these countries out, in particular Greece. And this has led to bitterness within Greece. There is a party called the Golden Dawn, which is an anti-immigrant party. And unemployment in Greece is somewhere in the ballpark of 25%, with immigrants flooding in. The situation in Greece is very tense. There's a lot of resentment against the Greek government, against the EU, and the EU resentment back that they're having to bail out the Greeks who are fiscally irresponsible. Brexit refers to the vote this June 2016 that the British are having on whether or not to quit the EU. Possible consequences might lead others to exit the EU, might inhibit trade. The Brits are the fifth largest economy on the planet, and a lot of trade going on with their fellow EU members, and a lot of jobs. A lot of Europeans have gone, by the millions, have gone to Great Britain, which has one of the healthiest economies in the EU. So there's this broad concern of what this means if somebody quits, because this has not happened before, even though they've talked about kicking the Greeks out. The Greeks don't want to leave. The Greeks are basically, living off of other people's money. Examples of nationalism within various European countries. Scotland voted in 2005 whether or not they wanted to quit Great Britain, and they voted 55 to 45% to stay. Catalonia has voted to hold a referendum to leave Spain. Remember, Catalonia is that northeast province. Capital is Barcelona. Spain has forbidden them to hold the referendum, which has not been held, but this vote has taken place. There is a Catalan Independence Party in control of Catalonia. Belgium has two groups, the Walloons and the Flemings, who are basically the French and the Dutch speakers, and they are at odds with each other, and there's independence movements on both parts to break Belgium apart. Jean-Paul Sartre is a famous French existentialist after World War II, wrote some books, Nausea, Being in Nothingness, and existentialism essentially argues that we create our own meaning in life, that there is no purpose other than what we bring to life itself. And this is a philosophy which is kind of broadly held across Europe. maybe not so much intellectually, but certainly practically speaking, the Europeans after the war had become largely secular and non-church going. The Second Vatican Council is a meeting in the 60s in the Catholic Church in which they moved the liturgy from the Latin into the vernacular, into the local languages. And it's noted for its openness, its seeking friendship, seeking freer relations with both the Jews and with Protestants, although there's no change in Catholic doctrine. The Catholic Church has been very strict, very rigid, that there will be no women priests, there will be no permission to use contraception, there will be no okaying of abortion, no okaying of divorce, and no approval of homosexual behavior. So the Second Vatican Council does, though, put a friendlier face towards other religious groups and welcomes the national languages into the weekly Sunday liturgy. Social welfare state refers to the government playing a key role in the protection and promotion of the social and economic well-being of its citizens. And some examples of the social welfare state would be very generous pensions at old age, free public education, including university, unemployment and disability benefits, free public health care, dental care, very generous maternity leave that is paid often for men as well as women, paid vacations mandatory, mandated by the government. In fact, the EU requires that all EU nations have on their books that all employers have to give at least a 4-week paid vacation. Effect on jobs by the social welfare state. Well, taxes are very high, and who pays taxes? Well, basically businesses pay taxes, and this inhibits the creation of jobs. Across the EU, generally speaking, not in every places, but unemployment is higher than in the United States because wages are high, taxes are high to fund the social welfare state. Clement Attlee, again, he's the Labour Party Prime Minister after World War II, who sort of institutes a democratic socialist agenda in Great Britain. And the most popular thing, which not even Margaret Thatcher could touch, is the national health system, where the doctors and the hospitals are owned and run and paid for by the government. Dirigiste, or dirigism, refers to this direction of the economy by the government in France, and how this is similar to Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Remember, he's one of the philosophes, he's one of the Enlightenment thinkers in France, who says the government needs to direct the economy by imposing tariffs on imported goods, by subsidizing desired industry, and the purpose here is to develop a modern and industrial economy in France. And mercantilism comes out of this idea that the government needs to direct trade. And in modern day France, you have this same centralized attitude towards economic development. And you see this in the government building this high-speed network of some of the fastest trains in the world. You see this in the development of nuclear power. About 80% of French power is done by government-built nuclear power plants, and things like education and healthcare are all directed by the central government. Tensions between Russia and NATO / the U.S. and Eastern Europe. Well, the former Soviets, the Russians, are largely embarrassed, they're shamed, they're frustrated, they're resentful that they have lost much of their landmass, they've lost much of the population, they've lost a military that people feared, they've lost respect. And they see this in the West encroaching towards their borders, bringing troops, bringing weapons, bringing the former pieces of the USSR as well as the outer Warsaw Pact countries into all sorts of alliances, NATO and the EU. And the concern historically of the Russians has been unfriendly, aggressive powers on their doorstep, and they're doing a lot of pushback currently. Chernobyl is the name of a nuclear reactor in 1983, caught on fire and had melted down, released all sorts of radiation into the atmosphere. And Pripyat, which is the town of about 50,000 people that had this reactor, is evacuated, and there's this kind of a cordon, a zone of where people aren't supposed to live within about, I'm guessing about 100 miles here around Pripyat. And Chernobyl helped give rise to what are called green parties in Europe. These are pro-environmental, very, very anti-nuclear political parties that oppose the destruction of the environment, that are for protection of the wilderness and for concern for the environment is one of the things that should be right up there on a political agenda, and they're very, very much for direct democracy. Anyhow, as you prepare for this test, do look over your notes, do look over that last chapter in the book. Be looking at your review book. At this point, you should be thinking about the AP exam, which is from 12 to 4 o'clock on May the 6th, 2016. If you see me before you take the test, if you have any questions on the review sheet, come hunt me down and find me. All right, scholars, good luck. Happy studying.